We will hear argument this morning in case 2512.
The grievances we could go into with this system. I think we could be here for hours.
National Collegiate Athletic Association.
I think we have some proof, even a few years into NIL now, that people care about the logo.
There are too many people in power who have no desire to give up that power.
The NCAA's ever-shifting decisions, not stable decisions.
Does the concept of amateurism in college athletics even matter anymore?
They've capped it again without any sort of collective bargaining.
We'll finish with our unilateral decision. Everyone, welcome back to another episode of Unilateral Decisions. Today we're talking about something Charlie Baker is talking about, which is the idea of regionalizing non-football sports in college athletics. So he's talked about this regional model. I want to start from a more functional standpoint, where this is all coming from. It might seem like a basic question. Joe, we'll start with you. What makes football fundamentally different from all these other Olympic sports in NCAA athletics?
Well, I think there's multiple layers to that. First things first, football's traveling once a week. They're chartering. They have the ability to take everybody and, stick to a schedule. A lot of these other sports are taking commercial flights. When you've got Rutgers and UW playing in, soccer, let's say, one of them's traveling all the way across the country. They're taking regional flights. It's a midweek game. The kids are missing class. Even when they get back and they got to go to class, they're exhausted from traveling cross country. Then the sheer cost of doing that, over the course of, sometimes a 30 game season. I mean, that starts to add up pretty quickly. So I think that's probably the primary differences in football versus everything else.
Certainly some lack of student athlete quality experience. Throw in the money factor, which always speaks volumes to these universities. That leads into football kind of outgrowing this conference model, this regional model. We've seen all of this conference expansion happen because of football. So with this, Mike, how has football outgrown that conference model? And is it even feasible for conferences to preserve any regionality with football being a part of it?
Okay. So the first part of that question, I believe that college football has outgrown the way that these conferences were set up, the way that college athletics was set up really historically. And I think that, a big part of the reason is because of the national interest, because of the money that comes with the media rights. And the fact that part of it is because there aren't as many games, and because there's not as many games and it's more consolidated, you only have as many chances. You only have, 6 home games. You only have 12 games in general. And so the pressure to squeeze everything you can out of that has kind of driven it to be its own thing. We see in the NFL that it's really kind of become a fairly mediocre in-person spectator experience. We can all understand why, because on average on a Sunday, there's 400 times more people watching it on TV than there are in the stadium. And college football is getting kind of close to that. And so the way you can maximize it, as much value as there is for a lot of these schools in a 70 to 100,000 person seat stadium, the value is on the eyeballs that are on TV and the way that you can maximize that. And a traditional conference, regional, fixed model where exactly the schools, as much as the rivalries are a part of it. I mean, if ESPN could trade Ohio State versus Maryland for Ohio State versus Alabama, they would do it in a minute. And so that's kind of how we got here.
I'm curious from a legal perspective, Sam, we look at this, and Charlie Baker obviously knows college athletics, but it's one thing to say this is something that makes sense. It's another to say, could it legally happen? And that's often what the show comes down to. So what legal steps would have to be taken for a football, or maybe even throw in men's basketball as well? But for this, football is on its own. Everyone else goes back to regionality. You've got so many contracts in place now. What are those legal steps to completely uproot what we currently have?
Well, the first thing you'd have to do, it's not necessarily a legal question, but more of a, NCAA governance question, which is right now you can't have football-only conferences. You can have schools that are in conferences on a football-only basis, and maybe by some measure you can kind of make that work. But, I think one thing that, should be explored to this perspective is the idea of having football-only conferences, of being able to say, okay, well, the just like in hockey, for example, I'm a UMass alum, and hockey has the Hockey East that allows it to, conversely to what we're talking about, allows it to preserve that regionality where, yes, UMass for every other sport plays in the MAC now and plays against Sacramento State, which is still kind of an interesting thing. But for hockey, for men's hockey, they're playing against Northeastern, Boston College, Boston University, all those schools that are in kind of that geographic area because that's what they can do as a hockey-only conference. And, again, conversely, which kind of ironic, you could have football-only conferences where you could say, okay, yeah, we want to have the ACC. We want to have an ACC where we have Florida State and another one of my alma maters. We want to have Florida State be in the same conference as Stanford and Cal, and we want to make that work. But maybe we don't want it to be for the other sports as well. And I think there's an argument to say, okay, well, if you could have football, even if you don't have football in conferences, well, if they wanted that, then maybe Stanford and Cal would have been, only football, only in the ACC, and going to, other leagues for other sports. But clearly, that's not what they wanted. But if you have the option of football-only football conferences, maybe you can make that work. But on the other hand, the legal issue with that, and this is all winding up to this, is, well, there's a lot of television contracts in play. There's a lot of grand right agreements in play that you'd have to adjust or break. And who knows kind of how that would work? Who knows how, you get into the nitty-gritty of, renegotiating or I imagine the NCAA can't step in and say, we're going to force you to renegotiate it. I don't know if they can. I don't know if they have, even if they practically can, I don't know if they have the political willpower to do it. But that's kind of a big thing as well, just breaking those contracts.
What fascinates me when we're talking about this is coming from the president of the NCAA, but there's no real defined structure in how this would happen. So when we look at it, let's go to the non-football sports. We say we want to regionalize them. What does that structure even look like? How could that come together?
So this was a really one of the key components of the proposal that I put out in 2023 about how could you reimagine, and specifically in that instance, it was about college athletics in the West as everything was kind of crumbling around it. This could be reimagined for other parts of the country as well. It's not just that it could only work in the West. What I would propose and what I would put together is you have essentially an alliance of conferences. And this is trying to have your cake and eat it too, but I think as you're trying to set it up for the first time, you would at least do that. You would look at all options. And you can say, if we have an alliance of multiple conferences that comes together to be a multi-tiered fluid football affiliation, but fixed for those. In the proposal, it was 3, right? So it was 3 essentially divisions in football, but on a permanent basis for non-football sports, they were fixed in 3 different conferences. And it allows you to align around regionality, which is a huge part of what this is now, but also like-mindedness when it comes to institutional support for certain sports or student athlete support services, where you're going to invest, where you're going to put that money, what your ideologies are. And I think that even becomes more important in today's conversation around college athletics, where you probably have to make a decision about who's an employee and who's not very soon. And so the way that you are going to approach the rest of those sports, for me, it allows you, again, to have your cake and eat it too, because it allows everyone to still benefit from the financial realities of football, which is an important piece of being able to still take the whole program forward and make college athletics what it needs to be, what people want it to be, but also allows you to then decide for yourself where you want to sit with the rest of college athletics and how you want your athletic program to operate, and where you're going to put your money. And so the ability to say, hey, this, again, I'll use the same example of these 3 divisions within football. There are 3 different conferences, and you're going to set it up in a way that allows you in non-football sports to still maintain automatic qualifiers for the NCAA championships out of each of the 3 conferences. Access to the CFP is certainly a big part of the conversation, but in the non-football sports, you can say this top tier, this is what we've identified as the top tier, and it's fixed. In my model, football is promotion and relegation, and that's how it makes it fluid. But for the non-football sports, it's fixed, and you're choosing to be at the top level. You're going to earn the biggest, cash out and distribution from the media rights, but you're also electing in that decision to invest in the other sports. Because part of the strategy of this is to identify who are the people, the entities, the companies, the media groups who stand to benefit from an improved and regionalized Olympic sport model. And those people are part of that group is investing in this operation to where the guarantee is that those at the top level are going to invest in becoming the preeminent Olympic sport, or the preeminent, maybe a specific Olympic sport, or maybe basketball, or maybe something in particular that you as an institution have decided this is what we want to be, and these are the people we want to surround ourselves with. And so we're going to make that decision. While football can still play itself out on the field, you bring the creativity of new media opportunities, new rights fees, everything else that you're bringing to the table through some ideas that haven't been tried before. And so it allows you, again, I keep saying it's have your cake and eat it too, but it's an option. It's an option that can be explored. And we've been talking about it for a few years. And now, hearing Charlie Baker talk about it is exciting for me to have it be brought to the forefront again. To Sam's point, there's some longstanding contracts that was part of Charlie's comments when he said it, was that, okay, when these TV rights agreements with the conferences come up, maybe that's when we start to see some of these things change. And there's truth to that. That is what it would take. But I also think this coalition agreement and arrangement is a way that, maybe you could even try to slice that up differently too. And there's a way to bring it to the forefront earlier and at least have the conversations, because if a couple conferences are going to come together and talk about it, that's the hard work here. The hard work is the collaboration piece where everybody wants to be their own boss and figure it out for themselves. But I think that there's some inevitability here that at some level, this conversation's got to be had. We're seeing schools consolidate. I mean, at the lower levels, we're seeing schools consolidate. It is only a matter of time before the power has to consolidate at a lower tier conference, a mid-tier conference, and there's some of that happens. And so, as with everything we talk about, I'm a fan of having the conversation early.
Yeah, and if I can jump in there, because I think there's one really key piece of, everything you said was important, but there's one key piece that really stood out to me because, the lawyer in the room, and that's the employment piece. And I think there's a critical thing here that I don't know if Baker is necessarily kind of picking up on here, if he's necessarily thinking about it here, but it's something that college sports as a whole should be thinking about, which is the employment conversation. And the way things are right now is that football players, for sure, schools, at least at the higher levels, at least to, Division I and probably going all the way down to Division I, schools want to have an employment relationship with their football players, just not one where they're calling it a football relationship. But the courts don't care about that. But the issue here is that you look at the lobbying, you look at all the lobbying that the NCAA and conferences are doing to the NCAA. They want Congress they want the public, they want everyone outside of, or inside or outside of college sports, everyone just generally, to think about college sports as a monolith, to think about college sports as a whole, where don't look at the, 1% of college athletes that are, Division I FBS football players who are making a ton of money for their universities and, putting in these long hours and doing all these things, because, we want you to look at we want you to look at Olympic sports. We want you to look at women's sports. We want you to look at, the historically black colleges and universities. We want you to look at those because we want you to help save those. We want you to help, create a model, pass law that saves those entities. But the problem is by doing that, you're also inviting the courts to look at everything as a whole as well. You look at you look at the plaintiff class in Johnson v. NCAA, Ralph Johnson v. NCAA, which is the employment case that went in front of the Third Circuit, where the Third Circuit said, yes, there's it is plausible, it survives motion to dismiss, that at least some of these athletes are in fact employees. And there's if you read that opinion, there was actually kind of a disconnect, because the plaintiffs are, the lead plaintiff was a football player at Villanova. That's FCS. That's not FBS. That's by no means Power 4. You also have tennis players, you have swimmers, you have baseball players, you have softball players, you have all non-revenue sports. You have absolutely no Power 4 football players or basketball players in that entire group. But the court still, in their opinion, talked about Power 4 football and Power 4 basketball and the revenues that have been derived from that. Because again, you're inviting by treating college athletics as a monolith, by treating as everything the same, by saying we're going to treat Power 4 football, Division I football, FBS football the same as every other sport. You're inviting courts to do the same, and I don't know. That's just something I feel is kind of a little crazy for them to do, and maybe that's something that Baker's kind of picking up on here.
From a competitive balance side of things, we've seen the Power 5 turn into the Power 4, and a lot of people say it's just the Power 2 at this point when it comes to football. So I feel like any change in college athletics is going to be driven by those Power 2 conferences. So let's say they buy into this. This benefits them enough to make them want to move on from the Olympic side of things. So, Joe, I ask you, what benefit is there to an FCS football program, to a Mountain West, a now Pac-12 program? Where do those schools benefit if you separate football from the Olympic sports?
Well, it's student athlete welfare, first and foremost, in my mind. But it's also, we need these sports to cost as little as possible to keep them, but still have our football program and basketball program. And at some schools, there's some additional sports that you're spending money on as well. But primarily it's those two so that they can continue to make as much revenue as possible. Like that's what this is about.
So that's the positive side of things. I'm rational enough to see that schools have consolidated, like we've talked about. You're cutting Olympic sport programs. That's been happening for the last decade plus. Does a move like this, in your opinion, Mike, further that? Are there more Olympic sports, non-football sports that get cut because football is now no longer willing to share in the revenue they get?
Well, I think that's part of the rationale behind at least the way I'm trying to set it up and the way that I would put it out there is that what you're doing in my world is you are leveraging football for more of what it's worth. You're putting yourself out there. A big part of the proposal that I had was the creative scheduling and creating opportunities for media rights that are not currently happening because you're willing to just lean in and say that TV networks are willing to pay for compelling, interesting storylines. You're willing to do more things off the field. You're willing to just basically put football out there as a revenue-generating, money-making operation, while the difference between it's straddling this line between making sure that if your football program is playing at the highest level and you are earning every ounce of what you can out of football, that you're getting rewarded for that, and so that there is there's justification in making that investment, while balancing the fact that if you are not going to commit to being at the highest level in all of the sports, which a lot of schools are having to make that decision right now. Mm-hmm. They're having to make that determination for themselves. You still want one of the drawbacks to the idea of this fluid arrangement is like, well, I've got to be able to budget. I've got to know how much is coming in. And so truthfully, in the model that I put together, the delta of what you were going to make by being in the highest tier of football wasn't that significantly different. It was more so based on where you wanted to live with the rest of your sports. And so it shouldn't drastically change it because it shouldn't over-incentivize being competitive in football. That's already incentivized enough. The setup of this arrangement should not further exacerbate that. And so I don't think that you could go through this exercise and, be naive to the fact that how you set it up could very negatively impact Olympic sports. I think that has to be a huge part of the discussion as you're putting it together. It was certainly one of my considerations when I put my proposal together. And so I foresee an opportunity to really figure out the regional piece of it we talked about. It's going to keep more athletes theoretically home. I mean, there's a lot of athletes who are making decisions about where they want to play soccer or baseball or softball or volleyball based on the prestige factor of the school that they're going to go to. And they're making a lot of sacrifices to do that. They're making a lot of sacrifices to play softball at UCLA right now because your family doesn't get to watch you that much. Or it's really cumbersome for your family to watch you play a ton of your games. And so there's a lot of considerations around that. I'd like to believe that you'd be able to keep home talent home. You'd be able to keep great talent home. You'd be able to do a lot of these things. The families would come. The friends would come. You'd have more regional rivalries. Are there negatives? There could potentially be negatives. It could absolutely lead to some consolidation, but I also think that it could lead to people getting really intentional about what they want to be good at and what they want to be known for and what they want to have like-minded groups around them, do and perform well. And I think that in a lot of those instances, if you're going to make decisions based on who you want to surround yourself with, you're going to get better. You're going to get better at that. And yes, maybe that means a couple fewer sports. It might mean that. And there could be some short-term impacts that, are viewed very negatively, but it should be done with the intention, and they should be incentivized to do it with the intention of getting good at the things that they want to be a part of and be allowed to make that decision instead of having to make all these decisions that are basically about football. You've got a bunch of collateral damage and you're being forced to drag those collateral damage pieces along because that's what the rules around you say. I think that part can be fixed.
Well, Dom, Charlie Baker was asked that question, on Face the Nation. Is he concerned with, sports, being eliminated? And he talked about the sports that have been added since he became president. But and he essentially said it wasn't something he was concerned about. Paraphrasing there, but it is a concern. I mean, we're already starting to see schools lay staff off because, they've had all of these people in the department to support all of these programs. And if you're a school with, let's say 20 sports, you only need 16 to be a D1 institution. If those 4 sports cost you $2 million to operate on an annual basis, and that's probably on the low end, that's $2 million that's not going to your football or basketball programs. And then when you think about the staff that you could eliminate to not have those sports, now you're talking, several $1 million. And these are the real conversations schools are going to start to have here in the not too distant future. So it is a concern.
Let's make sure in the show description we get Mike's proposal out there for anyone that hasn't read it yet. Cannot recommend it enough. Came out a couple years ago when Mike was an associate athletic director. Some really good stuff. Gained some national attention then. But yeah, we'll bring it up so everyone can get the full breadth of it. It makes sense, which is why I don't think college athletics would be in favor of it. But with that in mind, Sam, let's say this does happen and there is collateral damage with some of these lost sports in NCAA athletics. If I'm a coach of a track team, swim and dive team, softball, whatever it may be, am I getting ready for a frivolous lawsuit against the NCAA if I lose my job if this happens? Where are those potential lawsuits with any damage that occurs?
Well, you can sue over everything. I don't think a lawsuit by one of the coaches would necessarily succeed, but there is an elephant in the room, and that elephant is Title IX. Because, of course, Title IX is always kind of the question here where it's always the, whenever you see people say, oh, well, because you're paying players now, you're going to get to a point where it's just football, men's basketball. No, it's not, because that would violate federal law. And can't even just throw women's basketball in there because you're still grossly imbalanced when it comes to Title IX. And you've seen a few arguments recently that, I'm not going to get too deep in the legal weeds here, but because of recent Supreme Court decisions regarding, administrative agencies, that, okay, well, the traditional Title IX test is not applicable anymore. That's been universally rejected. Title IX is still very much on the books. Title IX is still very much a thing. The 3-part test that we've all known to love, known to grow and to love, is still very much a thing, and courts are still very much holding to that. Everything from, just needing to have that substantial proportionality or history of expansion or accommodation of interests. And on that third prong, I think what a lot of people kind of misunderstand about it is courts have held, and this goes back to the Cohen case back in the early 90s with Brown University, courts have held that if you're cutting a viable women's team, even if it's for money, even if it's something where you want to save some money, if you're cutting a viable women's team, that's a Title IX violation. Like that means you're not meeting prong 3, and most athletic departments are trying to meet prong 3 by my understanding. So Title IX is still going to be that major thing. I mean, we're seeing Stephen F. Alston right now is kind of the big one where they're getting hit really hard with some Title IX lawsuits. A new one was just filed based on alleged retaliation a few days ago. You're also seeing Oregon get hit with Title IX lawsuits. San Diego State and Fresno State just settled Title IX lawsuits. I mean, these are still continuing to come. And while maybe the focus of some Title IX attorneys is starting to shift to, okay, well, maybe revenue sharing is part of it too, it's still going to be very fertile ground for, if these sports are cut, to file these lawsuits. And not only, and you're seeing in these settlements, and you're seeing in like the SFA case as well, not only is it a requirement to pay damages, but it's also a requirement to bring those sports back. So
that was going to be my question for you, was the rev share payments and whether or not those were subject to Title IX.
I could tell you a quick little story. I'm an editor of a sports law academic journal, and I remember a week where I think it was 2 consecutive days where one day we got a submission that argued very, very passionately, very, very persuasively that revenue sharing payments do count towards Title IX. And the day after, we got another article that argued very passionately, very persuasively, the revenue share payments do not count towards Title IX. The answer is, who knows? Title IX has been very stretched. This literally one sentence in the Federal Register. It's one sentence, and it's been interpreted by federal agencies, but it even hasn't been interpreted by the Department of Education in quite a few years now. It is not responsive to revenue sharing, and it's not something that contemplates revenue sharing. But that doesn't mean that courts won't see it as contemplating revenue sharing. And I think there's a strong argument that, maybe it's a coin flip argument, but I think there is an argument that revenue sharing payments do count towards Title IX. We just don't know yet.
Are we going to see that lawsuit?
Yes. We haven't yet, somehow. I'm honestly surprised.
Yeah.
I figured it would come. House settlement was passed, or was given final approval on June 6, 2025. I figured it would come on June 7th, 2025. I guess that was a Saturday, so maybe June 8th. But I'm kind of surprised we haven't seen it yet. But yeah,
future episode of unilateral decisions when that comes down. Before we get into our unilateral decision of today, we'll end on a potentially positive note. So for any and all of you, we've talked about the benefit to the non-football player with just generally a better student-athlete experience. It allows you to be more of a student. From a football perspective, why does this benefit a student-athlete if they're on their own?
Why does this benefit a football student-athlete? Regionality?
Well, having everyone else into a regional model football splits.
I mean, I look at this. I was looking at that completely differently. I think it goes back to what I said initially, about a regional model for everything but football. And that's not how I would set it up. But if hypothetically that's what we're talking about, it benefits football because it's saving the athletic department money. Like, you're able to invest more in your football program when you're able to save money elsewhere. And the more you're able to invest in football, the better the student-athlete experience is going to be for football student-athletes. When I'm thinking regionality, that's not how I do it. But hypothetically, if we're talking about football being different than everything else, that's where I think the positive impact is.
Money. Any other benefit to the student-athlete in football if they're on their own?
I'm just such a proponent of I guess, truth and just like being honest about what this is. And, I might be a little myopic in my view of, I spent a lot of time putting together what I think I would do in this situation. And a lot of it centers around leveraging football for what it is and the value that it is. And I think being honest with the athletes and the athletes understanding, and the coaches to that degree too, that this is what it is. And, in what I put together, if you're going to do a promotion and relegation model, you're driving interest. That is what you are, an entertainment product. And yes, you're going to be here to learn a ton of life lessons, and we're going to invest in that. And there is legitimate value in that. And I legitimately value that as well. But it's also going to be prescribed to you that at certain levels of the sport, you're going to do things a little differently because we're trying to drive interest and revenue. And I think that the more honest you can be about that, the more upfront you can be. And I think if setting it up in a way that you already kind of know where you're going to be spending the money that football brings in, yes, there's an argument to be made for how much of that money that the football players and those responsible for football should share in. But there are a lot of people that are responsible for the success of a football program that are not directly employed by a football program. And so that money should also be shared generally around the athletic department. There are a lot of people that put time and energy into football being successful so that the athletic department and the university at large can be funded. And so I just think that the more that is out in the open and upfront with people and transparent, it may be a little bit of a trickle down, but I think the athletes benefit from it. I think the athletes benefit from just more alignment, more transparency, more truth telling, and they know what they're there for and what that school wants out of its football program. And you're not led to believe you're here to win a national title, and that's all you should be worried about, when really maybe nobody else on campus is thinking that's possible and not worried about it, and you're just not really aligned. So I think that there's value in that for the athlete.
So we're all here talking about Charlie Baker's thoughts. Even in his role, he couldn't make those changes. Let's say you are in a role where you can make whatever changes you want, and Mike has an unfair advantage as he's already got a very in-depth feature on what he would do. But for a unilateral decision today, let's say you are the sole authority on redesigning college athletics. What does your model look like? How does it differ by sport, region, et cetera? What is that total end product when you're in charge of reformatting how we do alignment? Joe, we can start with you.
I just go back to regionality across the board, not splitting things up. I mean, you look at, take any non-football or basketball sport, few exceptions, but when you have, your highest attendance of the season at, I don't care what sport it is, pick soccer, volleyball, you either have a really high-ranked team, you've got a superstar on the other side coming in, or it's your rival. It's somebody that you love to hate. You want to, hold that win over your neighbor, right? Like, I can't imagine there's a lot of people that are Rutgers grads living next door to Oregon or Washington grads. Like, that's not all that likely. But when you get back to regionality, you start to see, attendance go up. You start to see people caring more. I think that starts with football, and helping to create those rivalries for everybody else. But that's also increasing the student athlete experience. And I don't know. We're talking hypotheticals and breaking things down and starting from scratch. Let's get back. And people can say, well, we've been switching conferences for 100 years, and they're right. But what it looks like today is not even remotely close. I would get 100% back to regionality and common sense.
What's the legal common sense here, Sam?
I think it's one where we acknowledge the reality that not necessarily going to say different sports, because I think there's inherent discrimination in that where, I've really pushed back. I've been published on this. I have an essay about this. The attitude that women's basketball, we just saw University of Louisville president say this, is an automatic money loser, or women's volleyball, which has been exploding in popularity, is an automatic money loser, or women's gymnastics is an automatic money loser. I take a lot of issues with those. I think there's a lot to be said of, well, you haven't invested in them, and you haven't cultivated the audience in them. But I think it's one where, not necessarily sport by sport, it's one where maybe level by level, you have a clear, distinct line between the top that wants to have an employment model, even if they're not willing to admit that they want to have an employment model, even if they're not willing to say, we want to have an employment model, even if they're saying, we want to have what looks like an employment model, but it's actually not an employment model because, wave fingers, magic, it's not employment, even though the Third Circuit has very much clearly delineated a test that says, no, yeah, they are employees. But I think it's one that leans into that reality, that looks at the Third Circuit test, that looks at the what is the right of control, and most importantly, that second factor of the Third Circuit test, who benefits from this relationship? And that is the key thing here, who benefits from this relationship, because the more you're flying these athletes, the more you're flying these soccer players and golfers and softball players across the country, and in the middle of the week and causing them to miss school, your argument for saying that they are the primary beneficiaries of this relationship decreases dramatically, and courts are going to see it that way. So if you're asking me what the structure would be, it's one where it's an elective structure, one where you can elect into it, that has kind of this top level that has their athletes be employees, has collective bargaining if the athletes are willing to do it. If not, there's antitrust enforcement. There's a maybe single conference governance, some way to kind of make that work. But one where the players are paid and the reality is acknowledged that they are employees. But then everything below that, you're able to kind of compartmentalize. You're able to say, okay, well, everything below that, we're going to go back to the traditional. And I don't like using this word, but I think in this context it does fit, the traditional student athlete model. But that needs to be enforced in a way where you're saying, okay, well, maybe you can have 1 or 2 games that are across the country or even in a different time zone, but everything else has to be regionalized in order to make sure that athletes are not missing class, to really have limits on the amount of time that athletes are spending in cannibal athletic related activities. I mean, just all these different things that make sure that you're actually doing what you're saying you're doing and putting the student first. And that's my rant for the day.
Before you get going, Mike, I do want to acknowledge, I think it took 40 minutes for our first collective bargaining reference, and it didn't come from Joe. So I don't know if that's a new success story or failure of the show.
Though I will say I did preface it by saying if the athletes want to do it, which is one of the big challenges here.
Yeah, totally fair. Mike, you've already done this promotion relegation. Is that still the model you would go with?
It is the model I would go with. And it's not like, as much as I appreciate and value the meritocracy component of promotion and relegation, I'll be super honest. It's the interest level. It's the value prop of having this, like, I called them games of consequence. Like, there's value in that. There's value in people having to, play for their figurative lives when it comes to what level they're going to be at. There's a lot of challenges to it. Player movement and all the different things that could come with it. Like, how do you keep this together if somebody can just transfer if they get relegated? Like, a lot of stuff. I'm not claiming that there's not. And anybody who wants to further talk about this proposal, I'm happy to reach out to me. Would love to hear it. I get going on this stuff, and I think there's a lot of merit to it, and that's why. And so I won't rehash all 22 pages of the proposal right now by any means. But yes, if I'm setting this up, I am setting it up in a way that allows football to be the driver that it is while still maintaining governance structure of everything together. And to me, it really kind of boils down to an alliance where you've got multiple conferences that cover the gamut of sports, and they don't all have to be the same as each other. I think that's what we've seen through this whole situation, is that you're having to put so many square pegs into round holes because you want to keep the facade of football competing. And I think if you can decouple that at all, I think you can get a lot of wins and you can make up a lot of ground on some of the things that people are just really scratching their head at about college sports. So this is my way of doing that. You can put football in its own blender and say, sort it out. And we're going to squeeze it for what it's worth. And we're going to let everybody else kind of figure out how they would like to operate. For some of them, that's not going to be as regional as maybe, Joe would prescribe, because maybe there's 10 schools that come together and say, we're going to be the preeminent baseball conference in the country. And that may be the whole South from coast to coast. So there's different outcomes that you could see from this. It's going to take some time to put it together, but I believe that there are so many people who stand to benefit from football, being able to chase football glory without the collateral damage that has been caused upon these other sports. We see it a little bit with basketball. Like, I think that's kind of the proof, is that there's so much value in the NCAA tournament that there are schools who are willing to say, we are a basketball school. I think you can get there with some other sports. And I think that's part of what Sam was bringing up as far as the lack of investment. Like, I look at softball. I've been around softball for years at this point. It's a sport that I at least know quite a bit about. There are a lot of people who stand to benefit, a lot of companies and organizations who stand to benefit from softball being of interest to people. It's going to come back for the 28 Olympics. It was gone for a few Olympic cycles. It came back in 2020. It went away again in 24. It's going to be back in 28. The height of these athletes' notoriety at this point is while they're in college. But there are people who can benefit from them being really household names for the next 4 years before the 2028 Olympic, or 2 years now, but before those Olympics. And I look at an example, the AUSL, the Pro Softball League, is actually doing a really good job of this, partly because of their partnership with MLB. And Rachel Garcia is this example that I keep coming back to. She was a 3-time Pac-12 Player of the Year at UCLA, multiple-time National Player of the Year. She was on the Olympic team in 2020, but she was still in college, and she wasn't at her peak performance. She didn't get to play in the Olympics in 24 because they didn't host it in Paris. She'll probably still be at the top of her game in 2028. But people have largely, outside of like the core hardcore softball fans, people have largely forgotten her name. Now, AUSL through MLB, she's at the MLB All-Star game. She's mashing home runs. She's pitching to people that can't hit her. People know her name again. That's going to be important for NBC in 2028. Like, they will profit off of that. The fact that people know who she is when she goes out there and dominates, even though she hasn't played college softball in 7 years at that point, because that's when she would have been known the best. And so now, if you have an investment level from people who want college softball to be at the highest level, but they stand to benefit from it after the fact, and those athletes being household names after the fact, then you can work something out. I keep coming back to the Olympic development piece every time we talk about Congress or single conference governance or anything else. And this is just another feather in that cap, that I think that there is an element of this that you can choose to say football's over here and has the opportunity to compete. And we've built this structure around football, but we're also going to govern everything else. Football is still going to financially benefit the rest of these groups. And then we can kind of parse a little bit more like what we want to be good at and how we want to structure our department and who we want to serve in our department, fans, athletes, sports, different entities across the globe, you name it, instead of having to say, well, we made this decision because it was best for football and we're just going to make the best of it for everybody else. I think you can have that cake and eat it too. And I'm really bullish on that opportunity. Joe, we talked a little bit about offline pulling media rights and how that would go into a regional factor. I'd love to have a discussion about it, even just briefly right here, because personally, I think that pooling the media rights, as has been talked about in the PCSA and some other things, I think that necessitates going away from regionality for football, because I think that once they're pooled, the value is in, I brought it up earlier, Ohio State versus Alabama, not Ohio State versus Maryland. And so I think that in order to extract the most value from a pooled media rights scenario, I don't know that you're getting the regional aspect of football. How are you reading that differently?
I think the only way to get to regionality would be to pool media rights. How else are you going to get, a school to leave the Big Ten, and go back to where it was before? I just think pooling the media rights is the only way you're going to get that to happen, knowing that I could be over here playing regional rivalries, but I'm still going to make the same. The only reason they left is because they were going to make more. If everybody's going to make the same across the board by pooling the rights, and I'll go back to one of the things I said when we had this conversation about media rights, I don't think all the value is in the conferences. I think the value is in the CFP and selling those pieces differently. I think that's where you could make the most additional revenue. But I don't see a school going backwards. So the only way to get them back into a regional conference would be to pool the rights. That's how I think. That's what I think you would need for that to happen.
You peaked up.
I think you can look at it both ways. I think there's an irony in this whole situation, because we're talking about pooling media rights, and this is the whole basis beyond the revenue share proposal that's now part of the Protect College Sports Act. It's the idea that, we can, even if it's just football, we can, by pooling our media rights, we can best kind of have the Ohio States versus Alabamas. We can, lean into the regional part of it to a certain extent, but or at least that, the Ohio State versus Alabama part, that part's already happening. That's what the Big Ten and the SEC are already doing. I think that's a big reason why, they and I think there's a lot of reasons why they're saying no to this, but I think that's at least one part of it, which is like what you're proposing is what we're already doing. Like, that's why we have Texas and Oklahoma in the SEC. That's why we have UCLA, USC, Oregon, and Washington Oregon and Washington were in a bit of a different situation, but that's why we have UCLA and USC in the Big Ten. We're already thinking about time zones. We're already thinking about moving beyond regionality to kind of best exploit our the value proposition that comes from televising football games. And yeah, I think you can look at it both ways. Where yes, you can have use pooled revenue as a way to do regionality, but I also see Mike's point where it's like, is that actually something that you would want to do if you're the television executive? So you want to get the biggest audiences, and those audiences don't come from Ohio State. Maryland is kind of an interesting example because Maryland was in the Big East in the ACC for a while. I mean, let's say instead Ohio State
Minnesota
versus Purdue, Minnesota, sure. Yeah. Like, do you actually want to have those games on television? Do you want to lean into the regionality more? Like, yeah, there are these historic rivalries here, but to the average fan, to the average consumer, is it more important? Is it a better game? Is it a more interesting game than Ohio State, Alabama? Probably not.
And there's a lot of layers to that when it comes to like competitive balance and scheduling and all those different things. Oh, yeah. And obviously that plays a part into it, and the NFL deals with it. Every pro league deals with it. But I guess I just side on the part that says if you're pooling media rights because everyone wants to make the same or similar amounts of money, I totally agree with you on the CFP being the value prop there. But you're really giving the control even more control somehow. Somehow TV networks could get more control, which is crazy. But you're giving that up a little bit to say, like, okay, we wanted to make the most, and they're going to say, here's how you can do that. Mm-hmm. And I don't think their answer is protecting regional rivalries.
No,
so
they're not. When we were talking offline, I'm not bringing up, pooling media rights as my solution. Pooling media rights is the only way I think you would get regionality to happen again. That's the conversation around media rights in this capacity.
Well, we got it all figured out. So until next week, we appreciate you all joining us on Unilateral Decisions. We'll see you soon.